I think what we're trying to do with this session, I hope, we haven't actually over-prepared, I think you'll find. But I'm Stephanie Flanders, now head of Bloomberg Economics. And what I'm hoping we can do with some excellent experts on the trade aspect of this debate is focus not just, I mean, the title of the session is Brexit and Trade, which is obviously what we're going to be talking about, but we're all quite clear that we're talking about UK trade with the rest of the world, not just with the EU. So we're going to keep it global if we can. I want to keep it contentful, as in commit content, but still be constructive and still be understandable to regular humans. Looking around here, I'm not sure there are that many regular humans. I think you're all kind of the realms of the obsessed. But just on the assumption that there might be some normal people here, we're going to try and keep it relatively comprehensible. So if we start from my far left, we have Professor Steve Peers from the University of Essex, and Ali Renison in the middle, running, I think many of you will have seen her speak before, she runs the Europe and Trade Policy Unit at the Institute of Directors, and Shankar Singham now at the Institute of Economic Affairs, running their Trade and Competition, World Trade and Competition Unit. Shankar, if I start with you, I mean, we'll just let people say a few words at the start about how you see where we are from a trade perspective, not necessarily from what would be the best case or the worst case, but if we think of the sort of roughly where we think we might be headed, both in terms of our goods connections with our goods relationship, trade relationship with the EU, and what that means for any potential trade with the rest of the world, and services. You know, how do you think of the implications of that for the future of UK trade?
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon to everybody. What I thought I would do in my very quick 5 minutes is talk about the year ahead, what we sort of need to do in the year ahead in the context of developing into an independent, the execution of an independent trade policy, and what does that mean? And what I'll do is I'll talk about the EU a little bit, but put it in the wider context of the global trade policy that the UK is going to be developing into. So what should we be doing at this point? And what I'm going to do is divide this into 4 sort of fundamental pillars and talk about what we should be doing in each of those and how things are going and how the current negotiations impact those. So unilaterally, in terms of our unilateral trade policy pillar, you know, what should we be doing? We should be thinking about what tariffs we can cut when we are an independent trade policy nation. Obviously, that implies being out of the customs union and out of the single market. That is the government policy, so I'm going to apply that. What tariffs you can cut? What tariffs you can cut in areas where you have, in agriculture, for example, where you don't. The tariff on the goods that you're not producing yourself and the goods that are not directly competitive with things that you are producing, that farmers are producing here. So we need to think about that. We need to think about whether there are areas where you might want to do this anyway. So intermediate goods tariff, Canada, for example, has lowered its intermediate goods tariffs to 0, essentially to make its manufacturing more competitive. And we have a big conversation about cars. Well, the auto parts tariff is 4.5%. Do we need to have a 4.5% auto parts tariff? The other area of unilateral activity is regulatory reform. So looking at the acquis that we will be porting over in March of 2019, how much of that, what are to do a real regulatory impact assessment and a competition assessment on that regulation that's going to be ported over? What is the economic effect? What's the competition effect? What's the trade effect of those things? And actually, Britain has a bit of an advantage here because we are one of the leaders of these kinds of regulatory impact assessments, and our Competition and Markets Authority actually has done probably more competition assessment than most jurisdictions. So to get a sense of what might have to change. Now, we've got a lot of unknown variables here. You know, we don't know whether we'll even get a deal. We don't know what that deal will look like. So these are the preparatory things that you would want to do. Bilaterally, obviously the EU agreement is incredibly important. Here I think one of the things we need to do is get much more on the front foot. I think our negotiators have been quite reactive to the EU, and I think getting much more on the front foot, actually starting to put out text ourselves. The problem with the EU is that if you wait until they come out with text, negotiating mandate, etc., there's a period when they are developing that. Once it is there, it's very hard to move it. So we have to get much, much more aggressive and much, much more robust. In that context, we did get a deal in the implementation period, Article 124.4, that talks about giving us the right to negotiate, sign and ratify deals, but that's only half the battle. Obviously your partners have to believe that you're credible. And so, therefore, we also have to be much more robust in our interpretation of the duty of sincere cooperation and common commercial policy after we have left. Clearly, it must mean something different than the way the EU has so far interpreted it, and we're going to have to be very robust on that score as well, because the EU will be saying to other countries, and they've said this quite clearly, they will be saying that we are still a member state, and we aren't authorised to do various activities. So again, getting ahead of that is going to be very important. Part of that will involve the trade negotiation with the US, which we need to kick off in earnest as soon as we have left, or March 2019. And there, I think it's very important for our negotiators to identify what is in the US interest to do a trade deal with the UK? I mean, we tend to talk about why we want to deal with the US, but we have to talk about why it is in the US interest to have a trade deal. And there are a number of issues that are relevant there. The desire of the Trump administration to lower market distortions around the world, joint US, EU, Japan declaration to lower market distortions in the WTO ministerial in November of last year, these sorts of things. And the fact that we may be one of the few bilateral partners the US can actually do a deal with, because no race to the bottom, no offshoring of US jobs, trade deficits, etc. And then plurilaterally, potential accession to agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But understanding that these sorts of things, and it's not just the TPP, but US, Australia, any deal, frankly, will require regulatory divergence. It will require us to at least have the ability to diverge from the European regulatory system. And if we aren't able to do that, then we won't be able to do any of these deals in any meaningful way. And then finally, the WTO process, which is very important. I mean, this is what's going on right now. And again, I think we're going to have to be much more robust in the WTO process and say to our trading partners on things like the agricultural import quotas, the TRQs, we're going to have to say that we are going to negotiate them bilaterally. Now, clearly, we have to understand that the EU's interests and our interests are not always perfectly aligned. And they are on the other side of the table. And they will not want us to negotiate our TRQs bilaterally. They will not want us to negotiate the novation of existing agreements we have through the EU bilaterally. They will want to do as much of that themselves. And this is where our negotiating skill is going to have to come to the fore. And we are going to have to make sure that we don't end up alone in a room with the EU, because that will not be a happy result. And there are a lot of other partners in the WTO who would want to do a bilateral negotiation with the UK in a lot of these different areas. And then finally, being active in the WTO itself, joining things like the plurilateral group on e-commerce, which was established as a result of the last ministerial, being active in a number of these groups, indicating to countries, and this is one of the most important things we can do in the international trade context, is to indicate to countries that we intend to offer greater liberalisation in the future, and that the future is quite near. If they don't believe that, and they may not believe that, then they will seek their pound of flesh right now, which means that in the TRQ negotiation, even in the novation of these existing agreements, we will have a problem, because they will seek to take as much liberalisation as they can immediately. So that's why it's so important that we have these bilateral conversations with countries, and we're able to say to countries, look, we can offer liberalisation in the future. For many of these countries, they're friends of the WTO system, which means that they are vested into the successful operation of the WTO system. The UK is the second biggest exporter of services, one of the largest foreign investors in the world. It will play a role in, assuming it is able to liberalise in the future and assuming it has a particular approach to trade openness. It will be able to play a role in that process, particularly as the US has sort of withdrawn from the WTO system. So I'll just stop there with those 4 areas, and I'll just say one little final thing is people talk a lot about what the government should do from now on, and I think I've said government needs to be much more robust and negotiate, be more proactive in terms of putting text on the table, particularly in areas like regulatory recognition, which will be a big issue for the UK-EU agreement. But the private sector also needs to do quite a lot of work. And I think the private sector work that needs to happen is understanding, what is the direction of travel of European regulation? What do you, as private companies, what do you want the world to look like? Not just what you want the UK-EU relationship, and because managers of the UK-EU supply chain will always want no change. I mean, that's normal. But what do you want the world to look like? If you're a global pharma company, what do you want pharmaceutical patent protection to look like? What do you want pharmaceutical, term extension, pharmacovigilance directives, clinical trials directives? What do you want? What is actually going to generate economic activity?
That's helpful. Ali, Shankar was looking at the next year, and everything he said was based on the presumption that we should be pushing, it's in our interest to be a rule maker across the piece in goods and services, and a tariff maker, thinking of ways of reducing tariffs in goods and services, which puts us on a certain path with regard to the EU. And I guess there's also a bit of an implication in what Shankar's saying, that there is a lot to play for in the rest of the world, and this view that the most important thing is to get the EU relationship right is incorrect. In what way would you differ with that assessment?
It's always great to come from a membership organisation, because you also have the data to inform, not steer, but inform, I think, some of the thinking. And I don't think it's as simple as a case of either or, but we know that when we've asked this question repeatedly to our members, and unlike other business organizations, we've long embraced the concept of sort of very robust embracement of free markets and free trade. But I don't think that necessarily means that sort of contradicts the idea that, not so much that they're sort of status quo biased completely, but that for them, market access with the EU is the most important thing to get right at the moment. And that's why I don't think I completely agree about the speed question. I'll come on to the wider sort of trade policy question in a moment. But at the moment, it's quite a difficult challenge for the vast majority of businesses to plan and prepare. We do a lot of sort of briefings where we can around what sort of rules of origin have looked like, for example, in other EU trade agreements. The difficulty with something like rules of origin is that, unlike with the ASEAN bloc, the EU tends to go product line by product line. It doesn't do sort of more generic type approaches to rules of origin. So, at the moment, we have to do a significant data mapping exercise with our members, because the government wants to make sure that going into negotiations on things like rules of origin, that they're not only thinking about companies that are trading with the EU now, but people who might be selling widgets in the future, so i.e. domestic-facing businesses, and figuring out where all their inputs are coming from. And so I think it's for one of those reasons that almost by necessity, the vast majority of business and government, including in the department, is looking at trying to stay still as much as it can, at least with respect to existing agreements that the EU has signed, because that's its own issue that I'll come to shortly. And I think when you look at this from a sort of an SME perspective, there's a sequencing issue here to a certain extent that faces both government and businesses in terms of the planning and preparation. I spend a huge amount of my time in Northern Ireland with our sort of branch over there at the moment, relating to issues, both sort of single energy market and the border. But when you go and talk to them about how planning is going, even if you take something like the Irish border, you would have to know to a certain extent whether you're going to have border inspection posts applying, or new border inspections applying to goods trade crossing the border. And that's one of those things that you really need to know some basic direction of travel, not just a basic outline, but is the EU going to accept some of the UK's proposals for mutual recognition in certain spaces, and what are those actual areas? Because at the moment, and I completely agree with Shankar, I know that there are political considerations for why people don't want to put things down on paper. Having said that, I think it's probably a better idea to do that than have nasty surprises for political constituencies at the end. So in that sense, for me, the focus is necessarily, I think, on the EU negotiations at the moment, because if there's anything I think that the saga over in America has taught us, the reaction to the potential of lost trade, the reaction to the potential of measures that will negatively impact trade, has set people alight more than any trade agreement has. Maybe that's the wrong way around, but it is the way that it is. And so I think in that respect, that's why businesses are looking so much at this from the vantage point of, short term though it may be, how can we focus all our energies on making sure that the EU negotiation is the right balance of market access and regulatory control? I do think, and this is where it will really depend on what the UK puts forward for this supposed three-basket approach. What are those areas that, it is proposing for equivalence or mutual recognition? What are those areas that it's committing to potential continued harmonization, I would say? I would go further than alignment, because some sectors certainly want that to a certain extent. So that really sort of will shape the sort of the planning that businesses can do, and I think that's one of the reasons that both government from DEXU and DIT are so focused on getting this right at the moment. I don't agree with the idea that the world's going to completely move on from the UK if it doesn't sort of start trade negotiations on day one, April 2019. And I think there's something that government should be really concerned about, which is that, I lived through the TTIP battles. I spent so much time talking about them with our membership. Not every business was in favor of TTIP, I can assure you, and going out and doing all of these debates. And I think that, to me, I wasn't totally surprised, because it was going on during the spying, the surveillance scandal, and there was this sort of anti-American sentiment building up in Brussels. But for me, that was, I think the UK has a huge opportunity to have its own independent trade policy. We can talk later why I think that's feasible within a partial customs union. But and so in that regard, I think it's quite important that we take the next sort of 12 to 18 months to really, because it hasn't quite happened yet, engage with both businesses but other domestic stakeholders to figure out what are the priorities in terms of geographical markets, in terms of objectives for trade agreements that we really want, because no other country gets to sort of, not completely from scratch, but construct a trade policy anew, so to speak. And I think that it's worth taking the time to consult with a range of different stakeholders about what those priorities should be. You look at what the New Zealand government publishes. It's this great sort of trade strategy 2030, laying out all those different areas. And I haven't really seen that from the government. It was a trade white paper, but it was very top line. It was very generic. So I think for me, it's, it doesn't mean that you can't have that independent trade policy, but I'm not sure speed is the most important priority at the moment, compounded by the EU negotiations.
Steve, I'm interested in how you see things, because that's quite a sort of ground-up view from Ali, of course, engaging with Institute Directors' membership. But going back to this sort of broader issue of, where the focus should be, where the energy should be, and where the potential real kind of pinch points are, both for goods and services. I mean, we know about Northern Ireland, but I think you could say that the Mansion House speech did give a suggestion of a way forward with a slightly different approach to rule-taking when it comes to the services agenda versus goods. How do you see the next year in terms of thinking through the trade impacts, and what are the most important features to focus on?
Well, I don't know how soon we'll actually get into talks with the rest of the world in the next year, or besides just the sort of rollover issue of existing treaties. And I don't know how much we'll get into detail of the negotiations with the EU and how much is going to go in that declaration, whether it's going to be 2 pages or 10 pages or 20 pages long, and whether it starts to look quite legalistic in the sense of the quite detailed structure of what a future trade deal will look like, and how much ambiguity there still is, how much there's still left to negotiate. So we have all that to look forward to. And of course, those two things are linked, the relationship with the rest of the world and the relationship with the European Union, because the degree of divergence from the European Union is going to be to some extent, a zero-sum game with the capacity of the UK to enter into trade negotiations with non-EU countries. But one thing that does concern me and has begun to concern me increasingly in the last few weeks is that the trade policy debate, I think, hasn't really stuck to facts, maybe one way to put it, but I think we often, I think in any polity, in the United States or Canada or anywhere, the debate about trade policy often turns on highly disputed arguments and things which may not even be fully honest. But I think what has happened in the last few weeks is that we've seen, I think, disquieting signs that maybe people aren't having even at the highest levels, to some extent, a proper fact-based debate on trade policy. Now, I did bring a prop, I think, to illustrate my point, and an iconic prop, in fact. For those of you who can't see, it's a passport, and I've even dressed so we can check this argument over the color. As you can see, it is black, it is not navy blue, so the idea of returning to blue passports is misleading. But my point is not the color. It's, of course, the debate we've had over procurement of these passports in the last week, and that is a really bizarre debate that we've had. Because, yes, there have been people in the government and supporting the government and supporting Leave or Remain who have stood up and said, well, yeah, it makes sense to have a procurement regime, and it makes sense to save the money they were saving on this contract by having it outside the UK. The company that got this contract makes passports from many other countries. The Royal Mint makes coins from many other countries, and so on. And that's what we often miss in this debate is that the people who are critical of trade often talk as if trade only means imports. People who are backing trade often talk as if trade only means exports. It does, of course, mean both, and you have to have a debate about them both together. But that hasn't really filtered much into the public debate. In fact, it's the opposition and a lot of people who supported the Remain side on the opposition in Parliament who have come out and said we should have no public procurement of passports at all. In fact, some people, not on the front bench, but in the Labour Party, saying we should have no public procurement at all, foreign public procurement at all. And now, you've got to step back and think about this. It's not only the company here which makes foreign passports. Public procurement in general, of course, opens up foreign contracts to British companies, as well as the other way round. And indeed, if we go into world trade talks or trade talks with the European Union or with any other non-EU country, there was likely to be a public procurement issue there, and then that would be a trade-off that we'd make against other objectives that we have in the talks. But if you're going to take a simple jingoistic attitude towards passports in particular or public procurement in general, then you're going to have a hard time having this debate. And as I say, the debate has sort of started to move beyond a kind of leave-remain dichotomy there. And sometimes people, on the other hand, bring a kind of leave-remain dichotomy into the trade policy debate. And again, I see examples of that over the last few weeks, because you had a lot of people on the Remain side saying, with Trump's steel tariffs, well, we've got to stay part of the EU in order to protect against that. Well, no, that narrative didn't really play out, because, of course, Trump exempted in some non-EU countries. But then people on the Leave side saying, this just shows that we have to leave the EU to have a separate policy. Well, again, that didn't play out either, because Trump exempted the EU. So you can't try and fit every debate that's going on into that argument about leave and remain. And I think also that people who favour developing trade policy and a rather robust free trade policy have to be careful that they bring Remainers with them, that they don't always cast the debate in terms of implementing the Leave vote, because I think you will find, and there's polling on this, that a lot of Leave voters aren't wildly thrilled about free trade. Quite a lot of Remain voters are. But if you're going to sort of say this is all about Brexit, which is misleading anyway, Brexit is just what happened, the cause of having a separate trade policy. But if you try and say that every trade policy decision we made now must be seen through the prism of Brexit, I think you're going to hugely distort it and have a number of difficulties going forward. And I mean, TTIP is the classic example, of course, of why, of the Leave side getting voters, both from people who opposed TTIP on the grounds that they'd be stopping TTIP, and from people who wanted free trade with the United States earlier than we obviously get it maybe as a member of the European Union. Now, you literally cannot satisfy both of those categories of people. You can't both have a free trade deal with the US and not. So at some point going forward, I imagine we'll be heading towards a free trade deal. And a lot of specific issues will come up in that. And I think we can't take for granted the public support that might exist for a free trade deal with the US in principle, because once you get down to nitty-gritty, there will be demands made. We have a different political environment in the relations with the United States than we had under the Obama administration. You will have, if he's still there, Mr. Trump tweeting about these negotiations. You'll have him tweeting about the NHS, as he has done already, and that won't be helpful. I mean, the NHS will inevitably come up, other public services will inevitably come up, and including if you revived international plurilateral talks on services, which would be a useful thing for the UK government to do, but I think perilous politically. And it's interesting the government rarely mentions it much. Perilous politically because the moment you start talking about services, A, people say, why should I care about the bankers? And B, they'll say, well, what about public services? How many of them are you trading away? Or you're privatizing the NHS. And of course, it's harder for this government to rebut those sort of claims than it would be for a Labour government. Labour government isn't that interested in free trade talks under the current opposition.
Just to take this back to because I'm trying to keep it sort of a bit onto the economics as well. Sure. Clearly, this is we're up to our necks in political economy here, but I want to at least try and be thinking through the economics of it. I mean, as Ali said, the relationship that we end up with and the key choices that are going to be made politically over the next year, which Shankar kind of assumed away because he said, well, we're just going to assume that this policy, the formal policy, will be implemented, despite some of the mood music which perhaps suggests it won't. Over the next year, we are going to be thrashing out this idea of how much do you lose from accepting quite a lot of harmonisation and constraint, at least on the goods side. And Shankar's assumption is you lose a lot. You lose, if you can't trade off both goods and services in proper trade, in muscular trade agreements, and you can't do the deregulation, then it's not worth, in a sense, it's not worth having embarked on this. Do you think that as one has the sense that the business community feels rather differently, that you want to trade off a bit of freedom in order to maintain those supply chains, at least in goods? Would you say, Ali?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not. I don't completely agree with Shankar's starting premise that accepting certain levels of alignment precludes you from doing. I'm sure you may want to correct me if I've got that wrong, but precludes you from doing a number of things in trade agreements. I think that you could make that argument, and that's why I'm a little bit puzzled by the Labour Party's proposal on a customs union, because it's not clear. A, are they talking about the UK negotiating its own, just not in goods, not on tariffs, or is the EU going to be negotiating with the UK as a member state? Because for me, I think that. I do think you have to have some control over tariffs in a trade agreement, some control, because it is a huge piece of leverage. But I think, for example, the thing that we proposed was, even though no one likes to talk about being like Turkey, and Turkey is in a very different foreign policy and security consideration than the UK, which I think has to be borne into consideration when we talk about these things. If you had a situation where, under I think what the Labour Party are proposing in terms of a new comprehensive customs union, the asymmetry, for example, that Turkey has, whereby if the EU reduces its tariffs, Turkey doesn't automatically get the sort of reciprocal access. It has to negotiate its own, and sometimes the country doesn't want to do it with it. I think that's sustainable if that's covering industrial goods. I don't think that's sustainable for agriculture, quite frankly. I think you have to have some control over tariffs in a trade agreement, and also they're the most sort of politically interesting ones to do anyways. But also, I think on the regulation of goods side, I mean, I am not in the camp that believes that it was so automatic, the decision with respect to staying in the single market, A, for financial services, but B, I think also, I was at the Food and Drink Federation earlier this week, annual dinner, and we were talking a lot about what happens if the EU decides that it wants to. There was an example recently on sort of glyphosate, which was sort of farmers across the spectrum in Europe were very concerned about it. If that had been banned and we had no say over it, I think that would be a huge issue for the farming community here. So I think that's why, to me, even on balance, if you come out in favor of wanting to stay in the single market, it's not a slam dunk, I think, for considerations of that. I do think, though, that it's going to be quite difficult to try and figure out how you do either mutual recognition or harmonization or equivalence on agri-food standards, so sanitary and phytosanitary standards with the EU, because there has been this talk about having high standards and similar outcomes if it's not done the exact same thing. But if you look at the US and the EU sort of regulatory regimes on this point, they both think they have high standards, and the EU definitely doesn't recognize the US's standards. So if one side bans something and the other side doesn't, that puts you into pretty different outcomes. And so I think on agriculture, that's going to be quite a difficult thing to get mutual recognition or equivalence decisions on, quite frankly.
And I mean, Shanky, you talked right at the beginning about what are the objectives, where are you going to be able to reduce tariffs? I mean, the one obviously that has gained a lot of press attention, and where maybe we've stepped into some of the sort of false commentary that Steve was talking about, is precisely on agriculture, where those tensions arise around it's the most obvious place where you would look to cut tariffs and maybe also deregulate or at least change some of the current rules, some of the things that Ali mentions. And yet it's also one that could be could be very difficult politically.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just clarify one thing that you said, Ali. It's a bit more nuanced than, it's certainly not either or, and it's even a bit more nuanced than exact alignment or non-alignment or sort of harmonisation. Because really, I mean, the way to sort of look at it is it's almost like a collar around European regulation, which is where your movement is in terms of regulatory coherence. So there will be in the UK-EU agreement, assuming there is an EU-UK agreement, a regulatory coherence chapter. And if it follows the normal practice of international trade agreements, it will include an agreement on good regulatory practices so that we're promulgating regulation broadly in similar ways, and we're taking into account the same sorts of things like business compliance costs, competition effects, trade effects. These are the sorts of advanced good regulatory practice agreements. It will also include regulatory recognition provisions, and the trick for the UK is going to be to try to make that collar as wide as you can make it, consistent with maintaining enough recognition that allows you to maintain the kind of relationship with the EU that you need to have. And that collar will differ in size depending on sectors and depending on areas. TBT regulation will be different. Technical barriers to trade regulation will be different from SPS regulation, for example.
But to just push you up, from the European standpoint, isn't that the classic cherry-picking scenario? We pick the areas where we think we can get a competitive advantage.
But the thing is, every trade agreement does that. So every trade agreement has sort of quotes cherry-picking. But you're right that what will happen, and this is why I think we need to advance text now, because this is going to be the biggest, most difficult area. When we propose this kind of mechanism, which builds on the existing WTO practice, it builds on what other countries have done in regulatory cooperation. So we're saying that, look, the direction of travel is like this, and we're asking the EU to be here. They will come back and they will say no. They will say, unless you are identical, we can't do regulatory recognition with you, which is not the WTO system. What we need to understand is the EU is an outlier in this with respect to the rest of the world.
But the difference for me is that a lot of trade agreements that have regulatory coherence chapters, the explicit or the link between that and market access is not as existential as it is here. And so for me, it's like to me comparing. When you look at what was being proposed for TTIP, they had a regulatory coherence chapter.
Sorry, could you just explain that? What you mean when you say it's not as existential? You mean you're
well,
not...
so for effectively, the degree to which you stay aligned is integrally linked to the level of market access, and that's why the starting point matters so much in different ways. Most trade agreements, you're doing a lot of regulatory cooperation almost for the sake of it because you think it's a good thing. It's not always as crucially linked to the market access provisions. And for me, financial services was a classic case for that in what was being proposed by the EU under TTIP between the US and the EU was that, yes, the EU kind of wanted to make the market access provisions linked nominally, but they were in substantive terms completely different. They were aimed at different things. They thought it would be a good idea to have better, improved regulatory cooperation as regulation and legislation between the two sides was being developed. But that, to me, was pretty distinct from, in fact, it was very negligible what was being talked about in terms of market access. Here, I think the two are much more linked, and that's because with most trade agreements, you know that you're starting from totally different starting points. For this, because it's being managed divergence, the link is much more robust.
And I think, while the EU is an outlier, of course, it's still our major trading partner, and it includes, we also trade with countries like Switzerland, Norway, Turkey, which are broadly aligned on EU standards as well. So I agree, we could obviously want a different approach to things, and we'd want to convince, it's in our interest to convince the EU to have a completely different approach, but it's not really in their interest to be convinced, and that's the difficult debate that you would have, or at least they don't believe it's in their interest to be convinced. But I wanted to just bring it back to the Irish border, if I could, for a moment, because I think one of the keys to any solution that might be possible for the Irish border is to have some kind of idea of limiting the divergence while thinking of the impact on the Irish border. So the fewer the differences in tariffs, and even within NAFTA, the three members have agreed on, it's not a customs union, but they have agreed on the same MFN tariffs for some products to speed trade. So the less the difference on tariffs, the less the difference on standards, then we can limit our checks that will have to take place somewhere to those traders in particular products. And if we're only talking about 10% of the movement or 20% of the movement, that makes it a little bit more feasible to think about what we would need to check somewhere away from the borders, perhaps, or how that would actually work in practice.
I can feel a sort of shuffling in chairs, which makes me feel like I should let you guys get a word in. And it's, we're exploring particular bits of this debate, but there's an awful lot of sides and strands, which I'm sure our panel will be very happy to engage in. So who has a question? Worryingly quick hands going up. Should we take a couple from the front? And then
My name's Stephen Wright.
Do you want to wait for the mic? And brief if you can, actual questions.
My name's Stephen Wright. One of the next things that might happen, subject to the parliamentary timetable, is that the House of Commons will vote for the UK to stay in or pretty much the customs union of the EU. Would the panel like to talk about some of the pros and cons of that outcome, or that possibility?
Okay. And the lady next to you.
So I'm having trouble with this idea of all these trade agreements. I mean, if I want to buy a car from local garage, I don't have to sleep with the salesman. If I wish to buy widgets from India, all we have to do is, do they perform to specification made of the right material? English contract law, and let's agree the currency. We don't need a trade agreement or any sort of stuff from the EU. Let's just get on and do the job.
Okay. I think there was one more over here, and then we'll go back to that hand there. Can you wait for the mic?
Tony Cox. There's a lot of talk about us participating in high growth areas outside the EU in the future, and the freedom that will be granted if we leave the customs union. Can the panel explain to what extent we're actually barred from participating in those markets from within the EU, particularly bearing in mind that the EU itself has lots of free trade agreements with those countries, and increasingly with those countries, which we are party to at the moment?
Germany being the classic example that's tripled its amount of trade going to China. So we've got a question about Ali was shaking her head talking about the prospect of a parliamentary vote for staying in a customs union equivalent relationship, and a question about why should we even wait to have all these trade agreements when we just go ahead and trade more with other countries, and this point that's often made about what was really preventing us from doing more with these countries, given that lots of other EU countries have been increasing their trade to high growth areas. Ali, did you want to go on the customs union?
The reason I was actually, and I should clarify, that I was shaking my head until I realised what you were probably referring to was because there are two, essentially, I guess you could say, votes on a customs union. There's the customs bill, which allows for the creation or continuation of a customs union. It gives the power to create one, basically, and that's in the government's own bill. And then I suddenly realised there is an amendment on the trade bill, I think, too. So that's what you were talking about. Sorry, that's why I was shaking my head. I'm sure sort of Shankar will expound on this. To me, It depends, and this is where the indefinite article matters. I don't think the UK can stay in the customs union, legally speaking. You exit the EU treaties, you exit the EU's customs union, and technically, really speaking, the EU only negotiates trade agreements for its own member states. So if you wanted to have a customs union, I think you'd have to have a new one, or you change the treaties fundamentally to allow for the territorial scope of trade agreements to include the UK. Obviously, the argument against having a customs union is being able to have full control over tariffs. For me, the biggest reason to either stay in a full one or a limited one is to minimize, for me, I know the Irish border is relevant here, but from a trading arrangement perspective, I think it's relevant with respect to rules of origin, and you don't have to prove that your good meets a certain threshold for originating content in the UK or under the negotiations the UK and the EU going forward. And even though I think there are lots of arguments that circulate around, well, we do this anyways, actually it's not as existential as I think for the UK, because we're so integrated into European supply chains, which means that actually to your question, yes, you can get on and trade and keep trading. The question is, at what point does the cost of the change to formal trading arrangements make enough of an impact on your bottom line that you may potentially shift production outside of the UK? You know, to me, it was really interesting to look at when Turkey was looking at whether it wanted to move back to an FTA from a customs union. The main reason, and they calculated the sort of the GDP and welfare economic impact, that they didn't want to do that was because of the what they call the rules of origin shock, i.e. it would suddenly be much less attractive to have your production in Turkey. And so that's what the big issue for manufacturing is in the UK with respect to not having a customs union.
Did you want to?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me address the role of Parliament in trade negotiations, because I think you're talking about one particular amendment, but what we are likely to see, unless I think there's a more sort of clearer discussion about the role of Parliament in a trade negotiation, I think we're going to continuously have amendments like this. Parliaments generally in the world have an up or down vote on a trade deal, but no country will negotiate with every member of a parliament. So if you try to help, tie the hand of your negotiator, which is the executive branch, so much that they actually can't negotiate properly on your behalf, you're imperiling the likelihood of any deal at all, which is why the government proposal allows, a customs union, some of the things that Ali has suggested. It allows you flexibility to go for these things if you can. But a trade negotiation is such a huge amount of back and forth that if you constantly have to refer back to parliamentary amendments that restrict the trade negotiating authority of the executive, you are not going to be in a position to do any serious deal. So I think this is a very important part. It is not.
Come on. The government's position is that the UK will go out of the customs union.
Yeah.
The purpose of the amendment to the trade bill is to cancel that and to say no, the UK will remain in a customs union.
Yes. Well, I think. I mean, the
EU, but it is designed in some ways to move nearer to the EU model. So, what are the economic advantages of that? I understand the point about the rules of origin, and what are the disadvantages? But that's a one-off decision.
Well, it's clear. You're going to have a lot of those sorts of amendments, and it's very clear with respect to a customs union amendment like that restricts your ability to execute an independent trade policy, because you are not then going to be able to negotiate deals with other countries, because you are limited in your tariff schedule control and you are limited in your regulatory control. And to the other customs union proposals, if the goal is free circulation, then it is not just the tariff issue, it is technical barriers and regulation. So it is single market. So, I mean, you referred to the Labour Party proposal on the customs union. It's really a proposal for customs union and single market, because it doesn't make sense otherwise.
Just to follow up on this point about the customs union, there is a sort of standard view which says you want to have and the reason potentially the sort of thinking behind this vote is there really are some big advantages, rules of origin, other things, for having the customs union. And by the way, it really only affects goods. So we'll still be able to have our trade negotiations in services, which is our advantage. Now, I was actually going to put to the others, I was saying, one of the arguments against that is to say, is it plausible that you're going to have lots of big agreements with other countries where you can't trade off your access, your trade access in goods against your great advantage in services? Because a lot of those deals that we've done, that we might have done in the past, would have been precisely saying, you get access to our market in terms of our consumers, in return for us being able to develop, having more access to your service markets. I mean, do you think that's a fair criticism of the customs union view, Ali or Steve?
I mean, so I come back to what I was saying earlier in the sense that I think it would be totally unprecedented to have a really substantive trade agreement that had no discussion of tariffs whatsoever. And that's why what we proposed was limiting the scope of what it covers, similar to what Turkey has. It doesn't mean that you can't try it, but I think it's such an important piece of leverage to have some ability to offer control on tariffs in a trade agreement.
So when you talk about the sort of proposal that you might have had, or many of your members would have had, which is around, because of the concern around rules of origin as well as the border in Northern Ireland, you'd be looking for a customs union type arrangement which did somehow retain some kind of tariff control. I'm just trying to get a sense of,
what the scope.
But there's no example of that anywhere. Is that right?
There is. Turkey is limited to industrial goods tariffs in terms of the tariffs that it shares with the EU. And that's my point about what they were saying, is that when they looked at what the impact of moving back from an FTA from the customs union that Turkey currently has, there was a big issue around what would happen to production that has now moved to Turkey in terms of intermediate goods manufacturing and exporting back to the EU.
And just this, I guess we should also respond to this point about, why can't we just carry on like Germany has and other countries have? There's nothing preventing us from trading more with these successful economies.
Yeah, so I mean, the issue here is the nature of your economy. So the UK is a heavily services-based economy. It's the second biggest exporter of services in the world. The trade barriers that exist, modern trade barriers that exist that affect services, are behind-the-border barriers, they're regulatory barriers, they're market distortions that affect trade and services. So these are the most difficult issues to actually resolve with countries. It's much, much easier to resolve goods tariff barriers and border barriers than it is to resolve those issues. You need maximum flexibility to be able to do that. And the reason why it's important for the UK to be able to do that with other countries is that there are significant regulatory protection and anti-competitive market distortions in the rest of the world. If that weren't the case, if the world actually had no distortions and these behind-the-border barriers were less of a problem, or if your economy was different, such that you were really trading in goods and agriculture, then your solution would be very, very different. If you look at the EU's agreements, they take a very long time to do because of the defensive baggage the EU has. The often quoted 28-month average time it takes to do a trade agreement includes the EU's negotiations, which take much longer. There are lots of examples of countries like the US. The NAFTA process was a 14-month process. Australia, US was a much quicker 15, 16-month process. The trade agreements don't need to take a long time. It depends on defensive baggage and political will. So,
it's not like we have a lot of that around.
But if you look at the EU's, if you look at the CETA, for example, and you look at trade and new services, or you look at the TISA agreement, plurilateral in the WTO, trade and new services with respect to data, you'll find that the CETA has no coverage on new services that include data, trade in data, because of the EU's position on data protection. And if you look at TPP, it does have new services. If you look at the Australian negotiation with the EU, they've taken investment completely off the table in that negotiation.
But Japan is basically about to commit not wholesale, but absorb pretty much a substantial component of the existing EU data protection regime, and it doesn't seem to conflict with the TPP language on data flows.
Well, I think it will. Once the Japanese do that, I think they're going to have a problem. I think data is one area where you may actually have a fairly zero-sum kind of situation.
There's an example that Ali was talking about. You can have quite a few. I mean, there's a lot of those examples, surely, where we could well be forced into a choice between the EU approach and the...
Well, you know, in the TISA, which is the plurilateral on trade in services in the WTO, the EU had to, having been one of the plurilateral, the initiators of the plurilateral, had to withdraw from new services. So, you know, the Americans said, well, why are you here? I mean, it's a plurilateral agreement. You don't have to be part of it. So I think there are some significant differences. The TPP, for example, is a much more deeply liberalising agreement than CETA.
Okay. But could I come back on data? Because that, as you say, it is a zero-sum game. The government has already committed itself to staying close to the EU's regime for both police exchange and digital business reasons. And there was also a lot of private litigants on that issue who will challenge the UK. They've got two different forms. They've got the EU and the ECHR form if there is a divergence. So that really is a difficult thing to manage.
And I was quite surprised, by the way, to see how vehemently the tech sector, large, small, etc., people who I would think that have, you know, if you look at it superficially, an interest in moving away from the EU's regime, they have sent some very public letters to the Secretary of State for National Trade and David Davis, making clear that they do not want, you know, particularly for the purposes of adequacy, it's very important to keep GDPR. I think there's a big question about what comes down the track afterwards, though.
Okay. So I want to make sure there's no quick... Yes, so we have a question at the back, right at the back, and a woman there afterwards. Yeah. But this...
Yeah, shall I begin? Sam Lowe, thank you for that. My question is because we're talking about the economics of these new trade agreements. The Treasury's modelling on the benefits of these agreements if you took into account the US, China, India, everyone, the benefits as being to the UK as being we'd be 0.6 or 7% richer than we would have been had we not done them, and that was in contrast to a sort of range of 2 to 8% loss from leaving the EU. My question is, Shankar, Ali, Steve, what are the benefits of divergence from the EU from a pure economic perspective?
And we have been coming back to that various times, but there's a woman here, yes.
Yes, hi, my name's Sandra from Renew Political Party. I suppose I did want that, the overview really, will the Brexit benefit our global trade or not? Have we been held back by our EU membership in our global trade? Has this been compensated by our EU free market access? And can we negotiate better on our own without the EU's leverage?
Okay, and there's I am going to take up this in the middle, but just one more right at the back, that guy. And we'll take these two.
Hi, given that it's 80% of our economy, could we have some thoughts on how the direction of travel on trade and services looks to shape up over the next 10 years? And then a specific question for Shankar. If you could suspend doubt around a negotiated outcome where we are in a form of mutual recognition, how would you rectify divergence on the Irish border to allow for a free trade agreement with America on the basis that they'll need SPS derogations to allow chlorine chicken?
Right. And on the front, lady here, yeah. Could you just wait? Could you wait? Sorry, could you just wait for the mic? Just dashing up the aisle now. This lady.
Thanks. Sarah Ludford, I'm the Lib Dems Europe spokesman in the Lords. And I just wanted to home in on this sort of economic and political scope for regulatory divergence, and Shankar talked about lowering market distortions. I'd be interested to know what examples he has. On the data one, I mean, it's not surprising at all that the tech industry wants to stay close to European data standards, which are becoming global standards, as is the case, for instance, in chemicals. US companies kicked up a fuss about REACH, but now they're all implementing REACH and they wouldn't want to scrap it. So I would like some specific examples of where Shankar thinks we can diverge and reduce whatever he calls market distortions.
Okay, so we don't have that much time, but there's, I guess, well, all right, well, one more in the front, because you had your hand up before.
Just very quickly, Peter Foster with the Telegraph. Steve, you said if 10-20% of stuff that goes across the Irish border needs checks, then you can start thinking about technical solutions. In the art of the possible, and Catherine Barnett said something very similar, if that's where we end up, how much is left in terms of our ability to diverge and do trade deals if we end up in that system? And secondly, we talk about defensive baggage. Do you guys have thoughts on geographical indications? Because I understand those are holding up, for example, the EU-Mexico deal, and they're very keen on the EU side to get that in the withdrawal agreement. And then again, the Brussels effect is incredibly strong as a result of that.
Right. So, worst nightmare for a moderator. We've got 7 minutes left, and I've got a request for concrete examples of regulatory divergence and the implications of geographical indications as well. A lot of these questions, though, are coming back to the same issue that I've sort of been raising quite a lot, which is this: the really fundamentally how much there is to be gained from being able to diverge, and the possibility that actually your trade, even if you have, if you add up the next 9 trading partners, it's still not as much as what you've got with the EU. So do you want to respond to a couple of those?
Well, let me, as you suggested, let me tease out some sort of themes from those questions. The whole game here depends on whether there are in fact surpluses available in the world, and if there aren't, or if we've made progress in reducing those available surpluses in the world through existing trade agreements and other things we've done, then this becomes, the answer to your question becomes very different.
You mean unexploited gains to trade?
That's right. So particularly with respect to structural reform issues in other countries and so on. So actually there are significant, in our view, significant surpluses available in the world. So therefore, and if you look at measures of actual wealth creation around, so things like measures of global industrial output and those sorts of things, they have been stalled for some time. There was a question about services, future for services. Well, one of the reasons why we haven't made progress on those sorts of structural reform issues, and just to give you a sense of scale, the gains from trade of border barrier elimination are about, at best, 2 to 3% of GDP, and you're doing pretty well if you get those. The gains from reduction of distortions behind the border are significantly greater. So the OECD has done studies on developed countries and developing countries where the developed country gain is between 7 and 8% based on the regulatory reform that these countries have already done, not what is available in the future. For developing countries, about 10%. So there are huge gains that actually are available, and services are particularly affected by this. Now, to Sam's question on Treasury, on the models, it is very, very difficult to measure the benefits of reduction of those distortions, and the ITC, US ITC report on the TPP says this very clearly. We figured out how to measure the gains of a tariff agreement just when it doesn't really matter. What actually matters is these areas, and the ITC report on the TPP talks a lot about ways that we can try to figure out what these economic gains actually are, but they are very significant. And New Zealand.
Aren't they going to accrue to those countries though? The ones that we get to deregulate.
Well,
given the low base we're coming from in terms of the trade that we're doing with them.
Well, I think what they do actually is, because we've moved to a world of competing global supply chains, what they do is they remove inefficiencies in the supply chain. And actually it's allowing the supply chains to be more effective, that generates global GDP gains. And since we benefit from global GDP gains, we will see the benefit of those gains. But they will accrue to the whole world. Now, in terms of regulatory barriers and what I've called distortions, not everything that the government does is an anti-competitive distortion. There are many, many regulations that basically benefit incumbent entrenched interests and prevent new entry. So you talked about REACH chemicals regulation, we talked about data, for example. If you actually ask the global companies on the data, not the managers of the EU-UK supply chain, do they think that GDPR, for example, is a good system in terms of data flow and data? Do they think it finds the right balance which will enable wealth-creating activities to take place? They will say no. They will say that their UK-EU supply chain wants to retain this. But when a government decides what trade policy to have, they're not merely responding to aggregates of all business inputs. They have to think about businesses of the future. They have to think about what the economy is going to look like. They have to think about consumers. REACH chemicals regulation substantially increases the cost of the product. And if you are a user of that product, you will pay a higher price. And if you pay the higher price, you may be forced to exit the market at some point. Okay. And we haven't even talked about financial services regulation, which we could go on for the rest of the
Oh,
afternoon.
well. We often
But then
talk
you'll miss
about
Nigel
financial
Farage.
services
So,
in other cases. Ali or Steve? Do you
So much to tackle there. I mean, if you're going to get into the question of where does it benefit to have quantifying the cost to the benefits of sort of diverging the future, what always comes back in all of the sort of the survey questions that we ask about this is maybe we'd like to have the ability to choose in the future, but there's very few substantive examples. The ones that sometimes pop up are around, I've mentioned this before to sort of people in the room, state aid for sort of investment capital relief, for example, the way that state aid has been used recently in terms of how it's applied to tax breaks. So some people say, the thing is that these are not discussions in isolation. They are traded off against market access laws. And for me, it was really interesting when I was last in Washington talking about, you know, what should be in a future US-UK deal on data flows. No one was saying try and strap back GDPR. It was talking about looking ahead. And one of the questions that really came up repeatedly in the room amongst people that don't like GDPR was, but are we going to be able to, and this is the US talking here, are we going to be able to continue to be an island of innovation in a world where access matters? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, the EU is very good at exporting those standards. So you have to sort of balance, for me, reach is an absorbed cost against the cost of moving away from it completely, particularly at a time when people are moving towards it. You know, and if you talk to chemical companies, the big chemical companies, sort of, you know, with HQs in Switzerland, they're looking at this and saying when it comes to production being located in the UK, no one's going to manufacture just for the UK market if it diverges, quite frankly.
Okay. Steve, do you want to get a last word?
Yes, I'll just try and answer one question about the Irish border. How would you go about it? I think, given that that's the kind of the immediate issue, which some kind of resolution has to be had in the withdrawal agreement, of some, at least a partial resolution, I think the UK should be thinking about what exactly is it that would be in the content of future trade agreements that would have an impact on the border. Where are we actually going to diverge in terms of tariffs or product standards? And to think about that while also thinking about how would we be enforcing not at the border or not much at the border that divergence. So, you know, can we or do we already limit the number of companies that would be importing American chicken? And is there some kind of feasible way in the foreseeable future that we could track all their imports to make sure they don't go near the border and so on? So just that would be the way to sort of build in that thinking now at an early stage. So it could be built into the withdrawal agreement and you could have an early deal on some kind of technical solution. It does require accepting some limits on our ability to negotiate free trade agreements, but you know, once you accept that, then focus on whether really big deals could be made and that would also be politically acceptable to the UK, and think about how you design an electronic system, if you can, around that.
But getting down to 10%.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an arbitrary
a lot
number,
of,
but
if you
like
say
that,
something
yeah.
up, but to the point, it means ceding really quite a lot.
Probably yes, but I mean, how much are we going to import vast amounts of American chicken through Northern Ireland? I mean, is that really, you know, something that we'd need to think about a lot?
And the other point about the Irish border is it's not true to say that there aren't all island, you know, you talked about a single electricity market, there's already a single SPS area for the island of Ireland, which we probably will have to continue. I mean, that is going to have to continue. Otherwise, you will need to have border inspection posts for veterinary and accredited handler checks and so on. So it's almost inevitable that we are going to have an all-island SPS area, and there will have to be technical checks and SPS checks, you know, inside the border. That doesn't mean you're putting a border in the Irish Sea, because we do have other areas. The Northern Ireland is exempted from the Climate Change Act carbon limitations and so forth. So there are other areas where it operates in that way, and we're simply, that's the deal we're going to have to do.
Can I come back just quickly on the GI's question? This to me is sort of exemplary of the wider discussion around, you know, if you were doing this from scratch, you would look at this and say, you know, if you're a sort of a purist on the free trade side, that the way that the EU approaches GIs is not very liberalising. That's not what you're supposed to use a trade agreement for, and that comes back to much bigger sort of, I think, cleavages that maybe will manifest themselves after we've left the EU, because we haven't talked about this stuff for a long time. You know, are trade agreements the best place to talk about intellectual property? I don't think so, particularly. I think they should be done outside of it, quite frankly. But we are now where we are. IP is a big export, and so everything there's a lot of people who would think that you should just talk about tariffs in a trade agreement. For me, I think it depends on what, in terms of where GIs gets to in the negotiation, what is it that the EU would sort of deny in return if the UK doesn't continue to extend the same GIs protection. Maybe Pete knows better than I do. I don't know what, it would be traded off somewhere else. I think the UK should think very carefully about whether it wants to accede to that request, because I think it's a huge trade distorting issue, the way that the EU approaches GIs.
So I guess,
and we don't register a huge amount of them in trade agreements in the way that other countries do.
Although one thing we do know is if we decide we really care about it, that will be absolutely top of the list.
Well,
for negotiations.
Scots whiskey, yes, maybe. But.
Thank you very much. We have definitely committed content. Whether we have got to a point of clarity, I don't know. But thank you very much for the speakers and the questions.